Parshat Beshalach. This, of course, is the parsha which contains the splitting of the Red Sea, Kriyat Yamsuf. And in the minhag is to stand up for the splitting of the Red Sea. And next week in Parshat Yitro, we stand for the Decalogue, Aseret HaDibrot, which is translated sometimes as the Ten Commandments. Now, there is the Mechilta. The Midrash Halacha called the Mechilta says that the Ra'ata Shivcha Layam Mashalo Ra'a Yechezkel ben Buzi, which means the simplest servant who crossed the Red Sea from the Israelite people saw revelations at that moment, but even Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, never saw. Ezekiel, of course, in the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, of Yechezkel, has his vision of the Merkava, of revelation of the upper worlds. And it says that the simplest of the Hebrew nation, of the Israelites, saw on the Red Sea things that even Yechezkel could not see. Now, this is a very interesting saying of the rabbis, because you would think it'd be more appropriate to say that the simplest of the Israelite nation saw more at Mount Sinai than Ezekiel saw. Why specifically do they say it about the crossing of the Red Sea? Why would that be more? Well, I don't know if it's more, but it would seem more appropriate to say that it's Sinai, where God revealed him, her, itself to the Jewish nation. So what exactly does this mean? God reveals himself to the Jewish people in two ways. One, of course, is through the Torah. And what happens next week in Yitro, of course, is giving of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, which encapsulates the first stage of what's going to be the Torah. But in a sense, it represents the giving of the Torah. And the festival of Shavuot, Jewish Pentecost, we actually have on the 6th of Sivan, which according to our tradition is the day that God said the Decalogue to the Jewish people, the Ten Commandments. In fact, the Talmud goes into such detail, it says it was a Shabbat morning at 10 o'clock in the morning. But it was on the 6th of Sivan, which in our tradition always comes out to the festival of Shavuot. So that the giving of the Torah is this relationship between God and the Jewish people, where God reveals himself to the Jewish people. So then why Kriyat Yamsuf? Because Kriyat Yamsuf, the crossing of the Red Sea, where God extracts the Israelite nation from Egypt, saves them from the oppression of the Egyptians, and gives retribution to the Egyptians. This is God's involvement in history. Normally, God's involvement in history is behind the scenes, because the more God gets involved in nature, in the natural world, that is, the less there is free choice for human beings. So in general, God tries not to interfere that much, but sometimes things are needed, that original push of the Israelite nation. When you see the hand of God in history, this is a great moment. And this moment, in a sense, is at least equal to what happened in Sinai, and much greater than what Ezekiel was able to see, because he was standing in the galut, in the diaspora, in the exile, when he saw his revelation. But the simplest of the Israelite nation saw great things because they saw how the hand of God actually works in history for that moment. And that was a great, great time. Now, interestingly enough, right after that great moment, we have two complaints of the Israelite nation. Complaint number one, they come to a place called Marah, where there are bitter waters. Mar is bitter. And they said, we don't have water. And they complained. And God shows Moses a tree, and this tree he puts into the water, and they become sweet. It's interesting. They cross through the waters, salty waters, and they're complaining about the bitter waters. And right after this, it says, remember that all of the infliction that I gave to Egypt, I will not give upon you, because I am God, your healer. The Hebrew word for machala, sickness, is the same letters as lechem, which means bread, by the way. And then in the next moment, right after that, they're complaining that they don't have what to eat in the desert. So first they complain that they don't have what to drink, and Moses is able to make the waters sweet. And then they complain they don't have what to eat, that they want basar, they want meat, and of course God gives them the manna bread to eat, and eventually also the slav, the quails, which fell in the evening. So this is also interesting, these two things. But let me get back to this point, because just before I address that, the things that they're given, the water and the bread, it says that they reached, right after this point, they reached a place called Elima. It says they went, right after it says, I am God, your healer, it says they came to Elim, which in Hebrew is spelled Elima, because that's the way you spell it when they come to Elim, where there are 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped by the water. Now, right away, of course, the Midrash and Rashi spells this out, wonders, why is it telling us that there were 12 springs of water and 70 palms? First of all, it looks like it's paralleling something in this book. Of course, the first thing that would come to mind is that there are 12 tribes. And that's exactly what the Midrash says, that these 12 springs represent the 12 tribes. But then you would think the 70, what would the 70 be? Well, if it's what happened until now, it would probably be the 70 people who came from Jacob's family down to Egypt. But that's not what Rashi brings in the name of the Midrash. He brings that the 70 represents the 70 sages who teach and interpret the Torah for the people. In other words, it has both these elements in Elima. The tribes, meaning seeing God's hand in Jewish history, that's called the 12 springs of water, because you can see God's hand when you watch Jewish history and the interaction between Israel and the nations. And the 70 trees, of course, Tzadik Katamar Yifrach, it says in the Psalms 92 that a righteous person is like a date palm. Those trees are like the Zakenim, the elderly, the teachers, meaning the wise teachers who teach the Jewish people the Torah. So here you have these two elements again, where you can see the hand of God. One is through Jewish history in the interaction with the nations. And the second one is through the teachings of the elderlies, meaning of the wise interpreters of the Torah. And where does this happen? In Elima. The word Elima, if you take it into gematria, its numerical value, comes out to 86. 86 in Hebrew is Elohim, which is God's name. So if you're looking for Elohim, the hand of God, you can find it either through the history of those 12 tribes in history, or through the 70 elders who are teaching us God's Torah. But also, if you take the word Elima and you split it into two, you have Eli, our God, and Ma, which of course is 45, which is gematria of man. It's man and God. This interaction between man and God, which happens both in Jewish history and within the Torah itself. So that's why the Midrash says in one place, great is the simple talk of the servants of the forefathers, even more the Torah of the children, even more than the Torah of the children. Because the simple talk of if you remember the story when Abraham's servant is looking for a wife for Isaac, the Torah tells that story 3 times. First, of how he requested for it to happen. Secondly, when it happened. Third, when he recapitulates the whole story and tells it to Laban and to Bethuel. So 3 times. Because stories which teach us how the hand of God works in history are also Torah. Now, so they're past Elima, and then we have the 2 stories, as I said. Story number 1, which actually happened before this verse, which is about the water, and story number 2 about the manna. Now, about the manna, there's also some very interesting things here. And when the manna fell for the first time after the people complained, it says in verse 15 of chapter 16, and when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, manhu, which is translated here as what is it? For they did not know what it was. Manhu. What is the manna? The Zohar points out, the Zohar refers to the manna as michla de mehemnuta, which means the bread of faith, because the manna was such that just enough, whatever you needed, that's what fell. You couldn't keep anything for the next day. Only on Friday, 2 portions fell because of the Sabbath, because it did not fall on the Sabbath. So it was also a test of faith. Are you going to have faith that every day, God will give you your bread? Because we like putting things away, making sure we have something for tomorrow, but the manna did not give that option. That generation had to show their faith in God taking care of them. That was one thing in the manna. But of course, they said also, manhu. What is it? Now, if you take the letters manhu and you switch them around, in Hebrew, it comes out to the letters emunah, which means faith. Manhu, emunah. Now, the interesting thing is, why is it manhu? As you know, in Hebrew, it should be mahu. What is it? Why does it say manhu? Which from that we have the word manna. So there are 3 possibilities. Rashi interprets man from the word Vayiman Hashem et hadag, like it says about Jonah. God prepared the fish so that Jonah be swallowed in it. In other words, it means prepared, meaning they wondered, how is it that prepared food fell for us from the heavens? Seems to come out of nowhere. Manhu, how is it prepared? That's Rashi's interpretation and Avraham ibn Ezra. Chizkuni gives a different interpretation. He says, man comes from an Egyptian word, which in Hebrew is ma. It actually means what? Meaning they're asking the question, what is it? And the third interpretation, which is probably based the way I understood Unklus, is they say manahu or minahu, which means, where is it from in Aramaic? Minahu. Where is it from? Where did it come from? I want to argue that the basic faith questions, or the root of faith in its question form, when we look at the universe, is 3 things. We look at the universe and we say, how is it possible that this whole ecosystem of our universe, which is so prepared and organized and intelligent, how did it come to being? That's called vayaman, from the word prepared. Now the second question is, minahu, from where is it? Where did it come from? All of a sudden, that we were able to be born into it. And the third question is, mahu, what is it? What is its essence? What is it really? Is it just what meets the eye, or is there something more? These 3 questions are fundamental to the religious experience. I'm not going to dwell on them more now. I did in an article, but they're very fundamental to the religious experience. So in this week's parsha, we really have an amazing experience of emunah, where the people, the Israelites, saw the hand of God, and this instilled with them. They were still their lower selves, in the sense that they complained, but they learned to live with the mud. And they did not complain after they got it. And by the way, that was not a simple task, because in this week's parsha, it looks like the man tasted like honey. It was such a great thing. There's a midrash that says it could taste like anything. But Moses spills the beans in the book of Devarim. And in Devarim, in Ekev, he says, "Vaya'ancha vayarivecha," that God inflicted you, and He made you, suffer and fast. From the word rav, you were hungry. Vayachilcha taman, because He gave you the manna. that you did not know and even your ancestors did not know, in order to teach you that man does not live on bread alone. So Moses, in his final speech in Devarim, Moshe says, it was an affliction that man had. You felt hungry all the time. Yes, it was nourishing, sort of like taking vitamins. You felt fine, but didn't really feel like you ate much, which was not a simple test, and they passed the test. So obviously they were at a certain level of emunah, of belief. But this chapter ends off with a test of emunah, because right before Amalek shows up, that nation which comes to contest the Jewish people, the Israelites, it says that they asked the question, which they shouldn't, is God in our midst or not? When the emunah wavers, when the faith wavers, Amalek can show up. We all know that Amalek in Gematria Safek is that doubt. Is our emunah, is our faith strong enough? But that's a discussion by itself. So this week's parshat, the idea of emunah, which comes from the divine, seeing the divine hand at work, which creates a great feeling of faith among the Jewish people, which is one of the two main pillars. The idea of the 12 tribes, the history of the Jewish people, seeing God's hand within this work of history, and of course through the Torah and the interpretations of the Torah from the elders, which is also how God reveals his wisdom through this world. And then it teaches us the test of the Michla de Me'emnuta, the bread of faith, which is that manna, and what the manna represents. And this is to prepare the people for next week when they're going to receive the Torah. Shalom, shalom.